Welcome back to Troubleshooting Agile. Hi there, Jeffrey.
Hi, Squirrel.
So we heard from a listener this week, and in fact, the listener got in touch with you. So why don't you tell us what the listener had to say, and we'll see if we can answer his or her question.
Sure. This is a little bit sneaky since the listener. It is someone who listens, but it was in a private chat group of some former coworkers, and it's someone who's moving into a management role for the first time and was kind of asking for advice and reading material. And I thought, well, that's a great thing to talk about on the podcast. It's something we probably have covered in the past, but it's probably been half a dozen years, and so it's worth revisiting. And who knows, maybe our answers even have changed.
Yeah, you and I used to actually teach an O'Reilly course on your first 30 days
That's
as a
right.
manager, I remember. That was kind of practice for, I think it was even before we had this podcast.
That's right. I went and looked. I think we had started doing the podcast. I was looking at the dates of our in our version history of the slides, and it's the first date was 2019, but I think we
Oh,
actually
right.
may have already had the podcast at that point, and we did it through 2021. So we did it for a couple of years, and couldn't find it on DuckDuckGo, but Google search came through that we were still there in the Safari O'Reilly's online course that we were listed, but they do say that there's no more of that course scheduled. So it's good that they realize the fact that we don't have anything currently on calendar. Um, yeah, so I thought that would be good. But it is worth saying, like when you say like someone's going to be a manager for the first time, the first thing you asked me was like, well, do we know what industry? Do we know what size of team? And I don't. So we kind of let's go ahead and set some parameters here because I thought that was good because it does change the scenario a bit, like what you're walking into. But let's assume it's somewhat a standard software as a service type startup, and it's a company with multiple teams, and you're going to be a first line manager managing a team for the first time. That's your role. But the focus here is manager as opposed to team lead. And so maybe you even have a couple teams, but you're definitely a manager as opposed to hand-on dev. That's the scenario. How does that
Okay.
sound?
It sounds great. And I remember when I was very first a manager, this was before I became a CTO sort of by surprise. And I remember being absolutely terrified. So I hope that the person who got in touch is not terrified. If not, if this person is terrified, then I'd encourage greater calm because someone has decided that you're capable of doing this. And that's what happened to me. I phoned up the person who said, you're in charge of these four people doing a fairly routine task. It was a data entry configuration task. You can think of it as an integration. That you wouldn't be far wrong getting two systems to talk to each other. And I had developed the software that helped these people do this work. And so someone said, well, the very natural manager of the people doing this work is Squirrel. He's right there, so have him go do it. And in
Okay.
terror, I phoned up the manager who had decided this above me. And he said, Squirrel, it's very simple. You have to think of it like a factory at this stage. Now, by the way, of course, we have lots of material on managing at a later stage. And we talk a lot about alignment and coherence busting and trust building and all kinds of other great stuff. This is before all that. And so I
Yeah.
just had to get this team actually working. And so what the manager who had assigned me said was, Squirrel, you just sit all four of them together and you start at one end of the row and you ask that person what he or she is doing. And they, of course, say, I have no idea. And you show them what to do first. And then you go to the next one who gives the same answer and you do the same thing. And you go on till you get to number 4 and then start again at number 1. Now, by that point, number 1 will either have finished his or her task or be stuck. And in either case, you unstick them and get them on to the next thing. And then you do number 2, and
Okay.
then you keep going around like that. It's like the jokes about painting a bridge, right? You get to the end of the bridge and it's time to start painting the beginning of the bridge again.
Right.
So that was how I did it. And by having that kind of rote activity and a sort of formula to perform, I got over my terror. So this is a story I often
Okay.
tell to very new managers. Your goal is to get the team to have some output. You want to help everybody in the team, you go one by one until each of them is more independent and doesn't need that kind of guidance.
Interesting. Very interesting. It's funny because I happened to be talking to a friend today, and on a different topic. We were sort of catching up and talking about changes in his career and how he's doing. But somehow we got on the topic of what I said is the number one mistake of leaders and managers, and I said of all levels. I was saying this very sort of bombastically or very broadly. So it's funny that this comes up now. I hadn't connected that we might be talking about this today. And I told him, I says, the number one mistake that managers make is they try doing the job of the people reporting to them rather than the job that they should be doing. And it occurs to me that hearing your story, you weren't making that mistake. You weren't trying to do the job for them. You were making sure that they were unstuck, that they had something to do, as opposed to trying to do it yourself. So that it seems like your that very simple algorithm had you avoid the number one management mistake. So well done there. Very reasonable starting point.
Now, when I'm doing this, I also give some advice about things people might want to read, and I gather this person might be interested. Certainly, our listeners might be interested in my reading list. I don't know what your reading list would be, Jeffrey, but I've got two. One is a book
Okay.
by Joanna Rothman called Behind Closed Doors, and it's quite old, and it refers to some agile practices that I think people have moved on from and have better ways of doing now. But the really nice thing about it is that it helps you to understand exactly what the steps are that happen that you don't see when you are an
Mm.
individual contributor. So if you're in the team doing the work, you don't see that manager telling me to go one by one through the team and then start at the beginning. You don't see feedback about the team's performance given from somebody outside, like from marketing. And it goes behind closed doors and helps you understand what all those things are, how those things actually operate.
Right.
And my second
Hmm.
recommendation is a book that Andrew Grove, who ran Intel for many years, uh, recommended. He actually wrote it so that he could give it to his managers, and it's called High Output
Hmm.
Management. And it again has many of these sorts of formulas in it for what he calls the breakfast factory, for example, and ways of measuring your team if your team's job was to make breakfast for everyone. Well, you're not probably making breakfast, you're probably making software, but a lot of the same things come in, counting the number of pancakes, figuring out how many eggs you dropped, working out what resources you need, what additional foods you need in order to meet the morning rush. Those are the sorts of things that you need to be doing as a very new manager, and he goes through them in a lot of detail.
Right. Very nice. You surprised me there. I was expecting a different second one from you, which is the 1 Minute Manager.
So I tend to make that one later in the process because One Minute Manager is sort of a good book to read after you've managed for a while. It tells you
I
some
see.
very simple ways to compress what you're already doing into 1 minute, but you have to run into the problems first, I find, before One Minute Manager is really going to help you. High Output Management is written for someone who's never touched any type of management ever before, and so is Behind Closed Doors. So that's why I tend to recommend those two.
Okay, excellent. Well, before I mention my top book recommendations, I wanted you telling the story about your first management job reminds me about my first management job. Um, and the scenario was actually I was first a manager in a technical support group at Borland. Anyone who remembers Borland and Borland Tools is probably a software developer because they were known for that, Turbo Pascal or Turbo C, which is how I got associated with Borland. Um, and the thing that I remember most about when I took over the role as manager is if I look back, my biggest mistake was not being very curious. I was pretty good in my job, which is why I think they made me a lead of one of the lines and managing people pretty early in my career. But I really wasn't very curious about people's experience. And that's something that stuck with me for quite a long time, actually. It is something that later led our mutual friend Benjamin Mitchell to tell me once, you seem to be pretty good at advocacy, but I'm not hearing a lot of inquiry. When the fact I was confused by what he said was probably a good sign that I needed to work on that skill. So I would say the easiest way to get into that, of course, is our book, Agile Conversations. We'll teach about that. Although my first introduction was actually the um, 8 behaviors of smarter teams, or ground rules for effective teams, as it was called back then in
Much shorter than a
2011.
book. So that is a good place to start for people who feel they need to get going quickly.
Yeah, so that to say that goes back to here. Now the other thing though is that when I started my first management job, and I said I was at Borland, which at the time I think was the third largest software company in the world. So it was back in the early 90s when they still did professional development, when they actually had trainers come in and train you in your role. And they in fact had a management training, and that was the first time I ever had a management class was there, and I learned a technique that I use to this day, which is called situational leadership. And the thing that they covered there was that as a manager, what you should be understanding is how ready the person that you're talking to is for the specific task that you're giving them. And this was very helpful to me because, like a lot of managers, I kind of thought of people as sort of binary. You had the people who were good, and then the people who were, not so good. And what this helped me do is understand that, well, people might be good at a specific task, but if I give them a task they've never done before, they're not going to be good at it. So rather than thinking about people as consistently good or bad, or ready or unready, I needed to think about it in a task specific fashion. And this actually works really well with the curiosity part in it. And I think it also works well with what you described earlier about your algorithm of going from one person to the next, is to say, okay, this is the task you need to do next. Have you done anything like this before? Is this something you're experienced with? To kind of understand what kind of support they would need, rather than just either assuming, oh, this is a good person, so they should be able to handle it without me, or assuming, well, this person probably needs me to walk them through step by step, not realizing that they may have prior experience something just like this from somewhere else. So that's something that first job really helped me with throughout my career.
And I had the advantage of having a very simple team. Nobody in my team had ever done this before because I had written the software that did it, and no one had used it. So it was my situation was very easy to analyze. But most listeners, and probably this person who asked you, Jeffrey, are going to be in a situation with more mixed skills. So something like
Yeah.
situational leadership may be helpful. I worry slightly that we're going to overwhelm people. There'll be lots in the show notes here. You don't need to read all of these in order to start being a manager. I think if you picked a chapter or two out of one of the options we've given, you would be in really great shape ahead of many other people who are beginning as managers.
Yeah, that's right. So I think there's some good information there, and some good key ideas. Treating people individually, making sure that they're unstuck rather than doing the job for them. Then I like the suggestion you had of learning what happens behind closed doors. It's funny because one of my top recommendations for first-time managers is a different Joanna Rothman book. I've actually never read Behind Closed Doors, but she later published a 3-book series called Modern Management Made Easy. And we had Joanna on our podcast, actually. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes of Joanna's website, where she talks about the book, and she actually has links to that episode, the 2 episodes where she was on the podcast.
Oh, fantastic. I'd forgotten. I'd certainly remembered having her on, but I forgot that was the topic. The only thing I'd say about the 3-book series is it's 3 books, and Behind Closed Doors
Yeah.
is a story about a person who is a manager, and she intersperses advice and the story. So it kind of goes down easy. I think
Yeah.
that's the place I would start for sure. By the way, I always have to warn people. There are other books called Behind Closed Doors. Some of them are not safe for work, so make sure you look for the one from Joanna, not something else about a completely different topic.
Yeah. Well, look in the show notes, and we'll make sure it's to Joanna's website, which hopefully, well, won't
That
send
certainly
you the
should get
wrong
you to
way.
Joanna's book. Excellent. Well, I think that's a super start for our listeners. Do you have anything to add, Jeffrey?
Well, the only thing I'll say is, we did say like, here's a specific scenario. If there are listeners who are in a different scenario, or maybe they're moving like to a different level of management, and they want some questions like this, would like some advice about their new role. Would love to hear from them because we can talk about the differences between what it is to be a first line manager versus second line versus executive and so on. I think if people are interested, that's something we could definitely get into.
Excellent. We'd love to hear that from listeners. We really take a lot of our guidance about what interests people most and what would be a good podcast episode from you. So if you have those kinds of ideas, one option is to stalk Jeffrey and figure out what private groups he's in. I'm now wondering what that group is, but an easier way would be to go to agileconversations.com, where you will find our book, of course, that we talked about, and free videos and material on running a conversational dojo, which would help you to improve your curiosity, and lots of other fun free stuff. Plus, you'll find email and Instagram and Twitter and X and Blue Sky and who knows where else we are. So there are lots and lots of different ways to get in touch with us, and we like all of them. So please do ask your questions, tell us you disagree with us, anything like that is always welcome there. Of course, the other way to keep in touch with us is to come back again next week when we'll have another episode of Troubleshooting Agile. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.